The fiercest wildfire of 1947 that consumed Maine and scarred the soul of New England forever. In October of 1947, fire swept across the state of Maine with such ferocity that it consumed entire towns, erased generations of history, and left scars that still mark the landscape today. This is the story of the week that Maine burned. Chapter 1. On the morning of October 17, 1947, the town of Bar Harbor woke to the smell of autumn. Leaves crunched underfoot along the cobblestone streets. The grand estates that lined Frenchman Bay stood silent, their wealthy owners having returned to New York and Boston weeks earlier. The summer season was over. The harbor was calm. Eleanor Mitchell stood at her kitchen window on West Street, watching the morning light paint the distant mountains gold. Her husband Robert had left before dawn for the docks, where his lobster boat waited in the cold Atlantic waters. Their two children, Thomas and Margaret, were already dressed for school. It was a Friday. The weekend promised nothing more than the quiet routines of a small coastal town preparing for winter. Eleanor poured coffee into a ceramic cup her mother had given her on her wedding day. She listened to the radio playing softly in the corner. The announcer spoke of baseball scores and stock prices. There was no mention of what was coming, no warning of the catastrophe that would soon reshape their lives forever. 108 days. That is how long Maine had gone without significant rainfall. Since mid-July, the forest had been drying. The peat beneath the trees had hardened into something resembling kindite. The creeks that usually ran cold and clear through Acadia National Park had slowed to trickles. Some had disappeared entirely. 90% of Maine was covered in forest. Miles upon miles of pine and spruce stretched across the landscape, broken only by small towns and the occasional farm. This was the heart of New England, a region defined by its trees, its rocky coastline, and its stubborn independence. For generations, these forests had provided timber, shelter, and livelihood. But in the autumn of 1947, they had become something else entirely. They had become fuel. At 4:17 that afternoon, the Bar Harbor Fire Department received a telephone call from a woman named Helen Gilbert. She reported smoke rising from a cranberry bog located between her home and the boundary of Acadia National Park. The bog sat near a place the locals called Dolliver's Dump, a modest clearing where residents discarded their refuse. Fire Chief David Sleeper dispatched 2 men to investigate. They found a small fire smoldering in the underbrush. Nothing unusual. Fires happened every autumn when farmers burned their fields or campers left their fires unattended. The men dug a trench around the flames, confident they had contained the threat. But this fire was different. Beneath the surface, flames crept through the dried peat, invisible to those standing above. The fire was not extinguished. It was merely hiding, gathering strength in the darkness below. That night, Robert Mitchell returned home with his catch. Eleanor prepared dinner, while the children did their homework at the kitchen table. Outside, the sky darkened normally. Stars appeared over Frenchman Bay. No one in Bar Harbor knew that a monster was awakening in the forest just 3 miles away. The fire smoldered through the weekend. On Saturday, it blackened 40 more acres, still burning mostly underground. Forest rangers monitored its progress but remained confident. The fire was moving slowly. The winds were calm. There was talk of rain coming early the following week. Sunday arrived with the same dry air and cloudless sky. Churches across Bar Harbor filled with families dressed in their finest clothes. Reverend James Patterson stood before his congregation at St. Saviour's Episcopal Church and spoke of gratitude. He reminded them to count their blessings. He could not have known that within days his church would be threatened by flames and his congregation scattered across the state. By Monday morning, October 20th, the fire had consumed 169 acres. It remained a local concern, mentioned briefly in the Bar Harbor Times alongside advertisements for winter coats and notices about upcoming town meetings. Most residents went about their daily routines with no awareness of the growing danger. Helen Gilbert watched the sky from her porch. The smoke had thickened since Friday. It no longer rose in thin wisps but in heavy columns that drifted across the afternoon sun. She called the fire department again. They assured her everything was under control. But the wind was changing. Weather reports from the mainland spoke of a front approaching from the southwest. It would bring cooler temperatures and possibly the rain everyone had been waiting for. What the forecasters failed to predict was what would come first. Before the rain, there would be wind, and the wind would be fierce. Eleanor Mitchell noticed the change on Tuesday morning. The air felt different. There was an electricity to it, a tension she could not quite name. The trees along West Street swayed more than usual. Papers blew across the sidewalk. Thomas complained that the wind made his eyes itch. By Tuesday afternoon, the fire that had been crawling through the forest for 5 days suddenly exploded. Strong winds fanned the smoldering flames into an inferno. What had been 169 acres became 2,000 acres in a matter of hours. The fire raced through Acadia National Park, consuming everything in its path. Park rangers who had been calmly monitoring the situation suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. They called for reinforcements. The Army Air Corps responded. The Navy sent personnel from nearby bases. The Coast Guard mobilized. Students from the University of Maine abandoned their classrooms and drove north to fight the flames. Even seminarians from Bangor Theological Seminary joined the effort. But the fire moved faster than anyone anticipated. It jumped fire breaks. It leaped across roads. It crowned in the treetops and rained embers down on areas that firefighters thought were safe. The volunteers who arrived to help were met with a scene of chaos and desperation. Robert Mitchell saw the glow in the sky as he brought his boat into the harbor that evening. The sunset was the wrong color. Instead of the soft oranges and pinks he had watched every evening of his life, the sky burned an angry red. Smoke obscured the stars. The air tasted of ash. He ran from the docks to his home on West Street. Eleanor met him at the door, their children clutching her skirt. She had heard the sirens. She had seen the neighbors packing their cars, but no one had told them to leave, not yet. That night, the Mitchell family slept in their clothes, suitcases packed and waiting by the door. They did not know that by the following evening, their entire world would be transformed. They did not know that the fire racing toward them would become the defining moment of their lives and the worst natural disaster in the history of the state of Maine. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because what happens next in this story is something you will never forget, and you deserve to witness every moment of it. Chapter 2. Wednesday, October 22nd, dawned grey and ominous. The smoke that had been visible on the horizon now hung over Bar Harbor like a shroud. Visibility dropped to less than a mile. Children who walked to school found their eyes watering and their throats raw. Teachers kept windows closed despite the warmth, but the smell of burning forest seeped through every crack. Fire Chief David Sleeper had not slept in 3 days. His department of 12 men had been supplemented by hundreds of volunteers, but it was not enough. The fire had grown to nearly 5,000 acres. It burned on 3 fronts simultaneously, racing through the dried forest with terrifying speed. At the Abbey Museum near Sieur de Mont's Spring, curator Margaret Young rushed to save artifacts that had been collected over decades. Native American tools, colonial documents, photographs from the early days of the national park. She loaded boxes into her automobile, knowing she could save only a fraction of what the museum held. Behind her, the mountains glowed orange against the smoke-darkened sky. Across the island, similar scenes played out in homes and businesses. Martha Sullivan, who had run the village green grocery store for 23 years, stood behind her counter and watched customers stream through. They were not buying groceries. They were asking questions. Should they leave? Where should they go? What about their homes? Martha had no answers. She only knew that the canned goods on her shelves and the fresh bread delivered that morning might be the last provisions this town would see for weeks. She gave credit to those who could not pay. She gave food away to those who had nothing. When the fire was over, her account books would show thousands of dollars in unpaid bills. She never collected a single one. The wealthy summer residents had departed months ago, leaving their mansions in the care of caretakers and groundskeepers. These workers now faced an impossible choice. They could flee to safety and abandon the properties they had been trusted to protect, or they could stay and fight, risking their lives for homes that belonged to people who were hundreds of miles away in New York and Philadelphia. Many chose to stay. Samuel Hodge, who had maintained the Harriman estate for 15 years, refused to leave. He organized a bucket brigade with the gardener and the cook. They soaked the roof and the walls, drawing water from the ornamental fountain until it ran dry. Then they drew water from the swimming pool. When that too was empty, they stood on the lawn with wet rags and beat at the embers that fell like snow. The Harriman estate survived. Many others did not. By midday on Wednesday, the fire had reached the outskirts of Hull's Cove, a small community north of Bar Harbor. Residents had been given 1 hour to evacuate. They loaded their cars with whatever they could carry. Photographs, documents, jewelry, clothing. One woman carried nothing but her cat. One man carried nothing but his father's Bible. The evacuation routes were already crowded. Route 3, the main road off Mount Desert Island, was jammed with automobiles. Smoke made it difficult to see. Some drivers pulled to the side of the road, overcome by fear and confusion. Others pressed forward, desperate to reach the mainland before the fire cut off their escape. Eleanor Mitchell watched from her window as the traffic crawled past. She had packed the family's essential belongings. Robert was at the fire lines helping wherever he could. She had not heard from him since dawn. Thomas and Margaret sat on the living room floor unusually quiet. They understood, in the way children understand such things, that something terrible was happening. At 2:37 in the afternoon, a police officer knocked on Eleanor's door. He told her it was time to leave. The fire was advancing faster than expected. All residents of the West Street area were ordered to evacuate to the athletic field behind the high school. Eleanor gathered her children and their suitcases. She locked the door to her home, though she knew the lock would mean nothing if the fire arrived. She walked down the front steps, past the garden she had planted in spring, past the fence Robert had repaired last autumn. She did not look back. She knew that if she looked back, she would never be able to leave. The athletic field was already crowded when they arrived. Hundreds of people sat on the grass or stood in small groups, watching the sky. Children played games unaware of the danger. Adults spoke in hushed voices, trading rumors and observations. Someone said the Malvern Hotel was burning. Someone else said the fire had been stopped at Eagle Lake. No one knew what was true. Robert found them as the sun began to set. His face was blackened with soot. His clothes smelled of smoke. He held Eleanor for a long moment without speaking. Then he knelt before his children and promised them that everything would be all right. He did not know if that promise would prove true. He only knew that he needed to make it. As darkness fell, the sky did not darken. Instead, it glowed with an unnatural orange light. The fire had reached the hills above Bar Harbor. It crowned in the trees and threw flames 50 feet into the air. Embers swirled on the wind like fireflies from some nightmare realm. Word spread through the crowd. The roads were blocked. Route 3 was impassable. Flames had crossed the highway in multiple locations. 2,000 people were trapped on Mount Desert Island, with no way to reach the mainland. For a moment, panic threatened to overtake the crowd. Voices rose in fear and confusion. Children began to cry. Then someone remembered the harbor. The boats. The fishermen who knew these waters better than anyone alive. Calls went out across the radio. Help was needed at the Bar Harbor town pier. Any vessel that could carry passengers was being summoned. From Winter Harbor, from Gouldsboro, from Lemoyne, boats began to converge on Frenchman Bay. The Mitchells joined the stream of people walking toward the waterfront. The heat from the fire was palpable even at this distance. Ash fell on their shoulders and their hair. Margaret coughed into her father's chest. Thomas walked beside his mother, holding her hand so tightly that his knuckles turned white. At the pier, chaos had given way to something resembling order. Fishermen stood on their boats, calling instructions to the crowds. Women and children first. Stay calm. Move quickly. But do not run. There would be room for everyone. Robert Mitchell recognized some of the boat captains. He had fished beside them for 20 years. These were not wealthy men. Their vessels were not designed for passengers. But they had come anyway, risking their boats and their lives to save their neighbors. Eleanor and the children boarded a lobster boat captained by a man named William Hayes. The deck was slippery with brine and fish scales. The smell of the sea mixed with the smell of smoke. Eleanor found a place to sit near the stern and pulled her children close. As the boat pulled away from the pier, she finally allowed herself to look back. Bar Harbor glowed against the night sky. Flames leaped above the tree line. Somewhere in that inferno was the home where she had lived for 15 years, the kitchen where she had cooked 1,000 meals, the bedroom where her children had been born, the garden where she had planted roses every spring. She watched until the smoke obscured her view. Then she turned her face toward the open water and prayed. 400 people were evacuated by boat that night. They were carried across Frenchman Bay to towns on the mainland, where strangers opened their homes and their churches to receive them. The Red Cross established emergency shelters. Local restaurants provided free meals. Clothing drives collected necessities for those who had fled with nothing. Meanwhile, on Mount Desert Island, the fire continued to burn. Chapter 3. Thursday, October 23rd, 1947. This was the day that would be remembered, the day that would be spoken of in whispers for generations, the day the fire came for Bar Harbor. The morning began with a brief moment of hope. Overnight, the winds had calmed slightly. Firefighters reported progress on the northern front. There was talk that the worst might be over, but the weather forecasters had missed something. A cold front was approaching from the northwest. When it arrived, it would bring the rain that everyone had prayed for. But first, it would bring wind. Wind unlike anything the firefighters had prepared for. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the front arrived earlier than predicted. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, and the wind shifted. Where before the fire had been pushed northeast, away from the main population centers, the new wind came from the northwest. It drove the fire directly toward Bar Harbor at 40 to 50 miles per hour. Fire Chief Sleeper was on the radio when the reports started coming in. The fire was moving faster than anyone had ever seen. It was jumping roads, rivers, anything that had been considered a natural firebreak. Trees were crowning and exploding, sending showers of embers hundreds of feet into the air. These embers were carried by the wind and started new fires far ahead of the main front. The town had approximately 90 minutes. That was the estimate. 90 minutes before the fire reached downtown Bar Harbor. The evacuation that followed was desperate and chaotic. Police officers drove through neighborhoods with their sirens blaring, shouting through megaphones for people to leave immediately. There was no time to pack, no time to gather belongings. Just get out. Get to the pier, get to the boats. Samuel Hodge, who had successfully defended the Harriman estate the day before, now faced an impossible situation. The fire was approaching from a new direction. His bucket brigade had no water left. The wind was blowing embers directly onto the roof he had worked so hard to protect. He made a decision. He would stay as long as possible. He would fight until there was nothing left to fight with. Then and only then would he leave. Along Millionaire's Row, the great estates that had defined Bar Harbor's golden era stood silent and empty. These mansions had hosted presidents and industrialists. They had witnessed parties that cost more than most families earned in a year. Their gardens had been tended by armies of servants. Their halls had echoed with the laughter of America's wealthiest families. Now they stood alone against the fire. The flames reached the first estate at 2:43 in the afternoon. Within minutes, the wooden structure was fully engulfed. The fire moved from house to house, consuming each one with terrible efficiency. Furniture that had been imported from Europe, artwork that had hung in galleries, libraries filled with first editions and rare manuscripts, all of it burned. By 4 o'clock, 67 estates had been destroyed. The fire had consumed 3 miles of shoreline in less than 2 hours. It moved so fast that firefighters could not keep pace. They would establish a line, begin to make progress, and then discover that the fire had already passed them on both flanks. Downtown Bar Harbor faced its moment of truth. The business district was separated from the burning estates by several hundred yards of open ground. If the wind shifted again, or if the firefighters could hold the line, the town might survive. Fire Chief Sleeper positioned his remaining men in a defensive perimeter. Volunteers from the university and the seminary joined them. Together they formed a human chain, passing buckets and operating hoses that seemed pathetically inadequate against the wall of flame advancing toward them. Among the volunteers was a young seminarian named Paul Chen. He had never fought a fire before. He had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult exam. But when the call came, he had not hesitated. He believed that service to others was the highest calling. Now he would test that belief. Paul worked beside a fisherman named George Whitmore. George was 47 years old. He had lived in Bar Harbor his entire life. His grandfather had built the house where George had been born, the house that was now directly in the path of the fire. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They simply worked, passing buckets, manning hoses, beating at spot fires that started around them. The heat was unbearable. The smoke made it almost impossible to breathe, but they continued. At 4:37, the wind shifted again. Not much, just a few degrees, but it was enough. The main front of the fire passed to the north of downtown, sparing the business district. The Criterion Theatre survived. The Jessup Memorial Library survived. St. Saviour's Episcopal Church, where Reverend Patterson had preached about gratitude just days before, survived. But the residential neighborhoods to the north and east were not so fortunate. 170 permanent homes were destroyed. 5 grand hotels that had welcomed guests for decades burned to the ground. The Malvern, the Belmont, the De Gregoire, the Robin Hood Inn, and the Thorndike all ceased to exist in a single afternoon. George Whitmore's grandfather's house burned at 5:12 in the evening. George watched from the fire line, unable to do anything but continue passing buckets. When it was over, when the flames had moved on, he sat on the ground and wept. Paul Chen sat beside him. He did not offer words of comfort. He did not speak of God's plan or the importance of faith. He simply sat with a man whose entire history had just been erased, bearing witness to a grief too vast for words. If you have ever watched something you love disappear, if you have ever felt the weight of loss that cannot be measured or explained, then you know what these people experienced. Leave a comment saying, "The fire takes, but it does not take everything," because that truth is at the heart of what happened next. The fire continued to burn through the night, but something had changed. The people who remained on Mount Desert Island were no longer fighting alone. They were fighting together, and in that unity, they found something that the fire could not destroy. Chapter 4. On the mainland, the refugees from Bar Harbor were scattered across a dozen towns. Churches had become shelters. School gymnasiums had become dormitories. Strangers had become neighbors, bound together by a shared catastrophe. Eleanor Mitchell found herself in a Methodist church in Ellsworth, Maine. The pews had been pushed aside to make room for cots. Blankets had been donated by local families. Food was provided by women who had spent the entire night cooking for people they had never met. Thomas and Margaret slept on adjacent cots, exhausted by the events of the past 2 days. Eleanor sat beside them, watching them breathe. She had not heard from Robert since the evacuation. She did not know if he was alive or dead. She only knew that she needed to stay strong for her children. At dawn, a Red Cross volunteer approached her with a cup of coffee and a piece of bread. The woman's name was Frances Greer. She had driven from Bangor when she heard about the fire. She had been working without sleep for 36 hours. Frances sat beside Eleanor and listened as she told her story. The phone call from Helen Gilbert that had started it all. The slow realization that something terrible was happening. The evacuation from West Street. The boat ride across Frenchman Bay in the darkness. When Eleanor finished speaking, Frances took her hand. She did not make promises she could not keep. She did not minimize the loss that Eleanor had suffered. She simply acknowledged the truth of what had happened and offered her presence as a small comfort in an ocean of grief. This was happening across the region. In Lemoyne, a farmer named Harold Jenkins had opened his barn to house livestock that had been evacuated from Mount Desert Island. Cows, horses, chickens, even a few dogs that had been separated from their families. Harold fed them all, knowing he would never be reimbursed. In Winter Harbor, the fishermen who had participated in the evacuation were already preparing to return. They would carry supplies back to the island: food, water, medicine, clothing, whatever was needed. They asked for nothing in return. The radio broadcasts continued throughout the day. Reporters from Portland and Boston described the devastation in terms that seemed almost impossible to believe. 200,000 acres burned across the state of Maine. 9 towns destroyed, 16 people confirmed deceased, 2,500 people homeless, and still the fire burned. In Kennebunk, far south of Bar Harbor, another front of the fire had consumed entire neighborhoods. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations found themselves with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The same scenes of evacuation and loss played out, the same acts of courage and compassion. Juanita and Franklin Spofford had tried to save their home on Granite Point Road. They had wet down their house with a garden hose until the water pressure failed. Then they had filled buckets and tubs from the wells and set them around the property. When the fire approached, they stood on their lawn with wet rags and fought the embers. Their house survived. Many of their neighbors' houses did not. In Waterboro, the fire had moved so fast that some families barely escaped with their lives. The exodus from the town had been a single file of automobiles, each one filled with belongings and people, driving through walls of flame on both sides of the road. One woman later described seeing the paint on the car in front of her begin to blister from the heat. The response to the disaster revealed both the best and the worst of human nature. Most people helped without being asked. They donated money, clothes, and time. They opened their homes to strangers and treated them like family. But there were also reports of looting in the evacuated areas, of people taking advantage of the chaos to steal from their neighbors, of vigilantes who appointed themselves guardians of abandoned property, and sometimes made the situation worse. The governor of Maine declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was deployed to maintain order and assist with firefighting efforts. Soldiers patrolled the roads, turning back sightseers who came to gawk at the destruction. Resources were prioritized for those who needed them most. At the command center in Augusta, state officials tried to coordinate the response, but the communications infrastructure was primitive by modern standards. There were no cellular telephones, no satellite imagery, no computer models to predict the fire's path. Officials relied on radio reports, telephone calls, and runners who drove between locations with handwritten messages. This lack of coordination cost lives and property. Firefighters in one town were unaware of what was happening in the next town over. Resources were sometimes duplicated, while other areas went without. Orders were given and countermanded as information changed by the hour. Austin Wilkins, Maine supervisor of forest fire control, later described the situation in stark terms. There was no unified command, no shared communication system, no pre-established mutual aid agreements between departments. Each town was essentially fighting its own battle, hoping that help would arrive before it was too late. The lessons of October 1947 would transform firefighting in Maine and across the nation. But those lessons came at a terrible cost. On Mount Desert Island, the fire continued to burn through Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Firefighters achieved localized victories, protecting individual buildings and establishing fire breaks that held against the flames. But the overall situation remained dire. The fire was simply too large and too fast to be controlled. Robert Mitchell was among those who stayed to fight. He had not slept in 4 days. His hands were blistered from handling equipment. His lungs ached from breathing smoke. But he continued, because giving up was not in his nature. On Saturday afternoon, he found himself working alongside Samuel Hodge. The two men had never met before. They came from different worlds. Robert was a fisherman who made his living from the sea. Samuel was a caretaker who served the wealthy families of Millionaires' Row. But in the face of the fire, those differences meant nothing. They were simply two men trying to save what could be saved. Samuel told Robert about the estates he had watched burn, the furniture from Europe, the paintings by artists whose names Robert did not recognize, the libraries filled with books that could never be replaced. Robert told Samuel about his home on West Street, the kitchen where Eleanor cooked breakfast every morning, the garden where she planted roses, the porch where they sat on summer evenings and watched the harbor. They did not know if either of their worlds still existed. They only knew that they were still alive, still fighting, still hoping. On Sunday morning, October 26th, something miraculous happened. Rain began to fall. It started as a light drizzle so fine that the firefighters could barely feel it on their skin. But within an hour, it had strengthened to a steady downpour. The first significant rainfall in 108 days. The fire did not stop immediately. It continued to smolder in the underbrush and beneath the surface of the peat. But its advance was checked. The flames that had been leaping 50 feet into the air diminished to a fraction of their former height. The embers that had been carried on the wind fell harmlessly to the wet ground. The rain continued through Sunday night and into Monday. By Tuesday, October 28th, the fire was officially declared under control. The immediate danger had passed, but the work was far from over. Chapter 5. When Eleanor Mitchell returned to Bar Harbor, she did not recognize her hometown. The route from the ferry landing to West Street took her through landscapes that had been transformed beyond recognition. Where forests had stood, there were now fields of ash. Where estates had risen, there were now chimneys standing alone among the rubble. Thomas and Margaret pressed their faces against the car windows, trying to understand what they were seeing. Their questions came rapid fire. What happened to the trees? Where are all the houses? Why does everything look so different? Eleanor had no answers. She could only drive forward, hoping that something familiar would emerge from the devastation. West Street had been spared. The fire had passed to the north, missing their neighborhood by a matter of blocks. Eleanor pulled into the driveway of their home and sat for a long moment unable to move. The house stood exactly as she had left it. The garden was overgrown but intact. The fence Robert had repaired still enclosed the yard. She began to cry, not from sadness but from a relief so profound that it felt like a physical force. They had lost nothing material. Their photographs, their furniture, their memories preserved in objects, all of it remained. But as she would learn in the days and weeks to come, they had lost something nonetheless. They had lost the town they knew. The Bar Harbor that existed before October 1947 would never return. Millionaires' Row was gone. The grand estates that had defined the town's identity for half a century were nothing but foundations and chimneys. The wealthy families who had employed generations of locals would not rebuild. They would take their insurance money and relocate to other resorts, other coastal towns that had not been touched by fire. The hotels were gone. The Malvern, which had welcomed distinguished guests since 1882, was reduced to a pile of ashes. The other historic hotels had suffered the same fate. Tourism, which had been the lifeblood of the local economy, faced an uncertain future. The forests were gone. Half of Acadia National Park had been consumed by the flames. The trails that had attracted visitors from around the world now led through blackened wastelands. The scenic drives offered views of devastation rather than natural beauty. In the weeks following the fire, the true scope of the damage became clear. Across the state of Maine, more than 200,000 acres had burned. 851 homes had been destroyed. Nearly 400 seasonal cottages were gone. 9 towns had been effectively wiped from the map. The human toll was equally devastating. 16 people had perished in the fires. Thousands more had lost everything they owned. The economic damage was estimated at $11 million, equivalent to more than $130 million in modern currency. For many survivors, the psychological wounds were even deeper than the material losses. Jane Cormier Obermeyer had escaped Bar Harbor in an army truck during the evacuation. But during the chaotic journey, an accident had claimed the life of her sister. Jane would carry that loss for the rest of her life. Esther Smith of Waterboro had fled her home with her 2 young daughters, driving through walls of flame to reach safety in Saco. For years afterward, the smell of smoke would trigger panic attacks that left her unable to function. Morris Gilley, the Bar Harbor resident who had given a first-hand account to the Boston Globe, spent the months after the fire rebuilding his life piece by piece. He spoke of the trauma with characteristic New England understatement. Everything was on fire, he had said. You just could not seem to stop it anywhere. But amid the loss, there were also stories of remarkable resilience and recovery. Communities that had been devastated began to rebuild almost immediately. Neighbors helped neighbors. Churches organized work parties. The Red Cross coordinated relief efforts that continued for months after the last flames were extinguished. The Satterley estate on Mount Desert Island had been largely destroyed in the fire. But Eleanor Satterley, who visited in the summer of 1948, made a decision that would shape the future of Acadia National Park. She and her sister Mabel donated the estate, including all of Sand Beach and Great Head, to the National Park Service. This gift expanded the park's boundaries and ensured that the land would be preserved for future generations. It was a silver lining in the darkness, a reminder that even catastrophe can inspire acts of generosity and vision. The forests began to regenerate almost immediately. Wind carried seeds to the burned areas. Grasses and wildflowers emerged from the ash. Within a few years, young trees began to appear, but the new forest would be different from the old. The spruce and fir that had dominated before the fire gave way to sun-loving species like birch and aspen. These deciduous trees created a different landscape, one characterized by brilliant fall colors rather than year-round green. Ecologists now recognize that fire plays an important role in maintaining forest health. It clears away old growth, opens areas to sunlight, and creates habitat diversity that supports a wider range of wildlife. The fire of 1947 increased the diversity of Acadia's forests in ways that scientists are still studying today. Robert Mitchell spent the winter of 1947 and 48 helping his neighbors rebuild. He repaired roofs, cleared debris, and did whatever work needed to be done. When spring arrived and fishing season resumed, he returned to the harbor and found that the waterfront had survived largely intact. The lobster boats still floated in their moorings, the docks still jutted into the cold Atlantic waters. The rhythm of life that had sustained generations of coastal families would continue, but Robert had changed. The fire had shown him how quickly everything could be lost. He held his wife and children closer. He appreciated the small blessings of daily life. He never again took anything for granted. This was the legacy of October 1947. Not just loss, but perspective. Not just destruction, but appreciation for what remained. Chapter 6. 75 years have passed since the year Maine burned. The forests have returned. The towns have been rebuilt. The scars on the landscape have faded, visible now only to those who know where to look. But the memory endures. In communities across Maine, historical societies maintain extensive records of the disaster. Photographs show the flames leaping against the night sky. Letters describe the fear and confusion of those who lived through it. Oral histories preserve the voices of survivors, many of whom have since passed away. Signs stand in towns throughout York County and on Mount Desert Island, marking the places where the fires burned. These simple markers serve as reminders of what was lost and what was learned. The lessons of 1947 transformed firefighting in Maine and across the nation. In the immediate aftermath, state officials recognized the failures that had contributed to the disaster: the lack of communication, the absence of coordinated command, the inadequate equipment, the non-existent mutual aid agreements. Within years, a comprehensive reform effort was underway. Maine established a two-way public safety radio network that allowed fire departments to communicate across jurisdictions. The Forest Commissioner received expanded authority to respond to emergencies. Mutual aid agreements were developed at local, state, and national levels. Training programs were created to prepare firefighters for large-scale disasters. Equipment was upgraded and standardized. Prevention efforts were expanded, with public education campaigns teaching residents about fire safety and the importance of creating defensible space around their homes. These reforms were tested again and again in the decades that followed. When fires threatened, the response was faster, more coordinated, and more effective. The catastrophic losses of 1947 were never repeated, but the human capacity for complacency is boundless. As the years passed and the memory of the fire faded, some of the lessons began to be forgotten. Forests grew back, and with them the fuel that could feed future fires. Climate change brought warmer temperatures and longer droughts. The conditions that had created the inferno of 1947 began to re-emerge. In recent decades, wildfires have devastated communities across the American West. The names are familiar: Paradise, Lahaina, thousands of homes destroyed, hundreds of lives lost. The scenes of evacuation and despair echo what happened in Maine more than 7 decades ago. The residents of Bar Harbor watch these distant disasters with a recognition that others may not fully understand. They know what fire can do. They know how quickly a normal day can transform into a nightmare. They know that no community is immune. Eleanor Mitchell lived in Bar Harbor until her passing in 1993. She saw the town transform from a devastated community into a thriving tourist destination. The old Millionaires' Row mansions were replaced by hotels and shops that catered to visitors from around the world. Acadia National Park recovered and became one of the most popular parks in the national system. Thomas Mitchell, who had walked with his mother to the athletic field on that terrible October evening, grew up to become a firefighter himself. He served the Bar Harbor Fire Department for 32 years, retiring as chief. He never forgot what he had witnessed as a child. He dedicated his career to ensuring that no one else would have to experience what his family had endured. Margaret Mitchell became a teacher at Bar Harbor High School. She taught history, and every October she told her students about the fire. She showed them photographs of the destroyed estates. She read them accounts from survivors. She took them to the sites where the most intense fighting had occurred. She believed that memory was the most important gift one generation could give to the next. She believed that understanding the past was essential to navigating the future. She believed that the story of October 1947 needed to be told and retold so that its lessons would never be forgotten. Robert Mitchell passed away in 1978 at the age of 67. His obituary in the Bar Harbor Times described him as a fisherman, a husband, a father, and a hero of the 1947 fire. It did not mention the nightmares that had plagued him for years after the disaster. It did not mention the anxiety that arose whenever he smelled smoke. It did not mention the ways in which the fire had marked him, as surely as it had marked the landscape. These hidden costs are part of every disaster. The trauma that survivors carry long after the flames are extinguished, the grief that emerges unexpectedly, triggered by a sound or a smell or a memory, the sense of vulnerability that never fully fades. But there is also resilience, the human capacity to rebuild, to recover, to find meaning in the midst of loss. The communities that were devastated in 1947 did not disappear. They adapted, they transformed, they found new identities and new purposes. Bar Harbor today is a vibrant coastal town that welcomes millions of visitors each year. Cruise ships anchor in Frenchman Bay, and passengers walk the same streets where refugees once fled from the flames. Acadia National Park hosts hikers, campers, and nature lovers who may never know that the forests they admire are less than a century old. The fire is remembered, but it is not all that is remembered. Also remembered are the fishermen who risked their boats to evacuate their neighbors, the volunteers who fought for days without sleep, the strangers who opened their homes to refugees, the communities that came together in crisis and discovered reserves of compassion they had not known they possessed. This is the true legacy of October 1947. Not the destruction, but the response. Not the loss, but the love that emerged in its wake. When the fire came, Maine burned, but Maine also endured. And in that endurance lies a lesson for all of us. If you watch this far, it is because you understand that lesson. It is because you know that stories like this one matter. Leave a comment saying, I watched this far so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own community and the people you love, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not already subscribed to this channel, now is the moment, because these are the stories that connect us to our past and illuminate our path forward. The fire of 1947 is history now, but its lessons are timeless. Prepare for disaster. Cherish what you have. Stand with your neighbors when crisis comes. And never forget that even in the darkest moments, human compassion can light the way. The forests have returned to Mount Desert Island. The birches and aspens that replaced the old spruce and fir paint the mountains with brilliant colors every autumn. Visitors who come today see a landscape of remarkable beauty, transformed by catastrophe into something new and alive. Beneath the soil, in places only scientists can detect, traces of ash still remain. The earth remembers what happened here, and as long as we tell these stories, as long as we honor the memory of those who suffered and those who helped, we will remember too. The fiercest wildfire of 1947 consumed Maine, but it did not consume what truly matters: the courage of ordinary people, the bonds of community, the stubborn determination to rebuild. These are the things that endure. These are the things that define us. These are the things that fire can never destroy.